Well, welcome everybody. I'm so glad you joined us today. Let me tell you about next month's presentation. I'm calling that Living with Your Imperfections and Those of Others. To be human is to be imperfect. We kind of know this intellectually, but we still engage in daily and often excessive self-criticism. Accepting your imperfections doesn't mean that you don't strive to reach for goals that are important to you, but it does mean loving and having compassion for yourself at every stage in your journey. It does mean being able to learn from your mistakes because they aren't an indictment of your inherent worth. It means recognizing your strengths as readily as you recognize your limitations and allowing yourself to enjoy life right now, no matter where you are in the journey. Accepting imperfections in others doesn't mean putting up with abusive or toxic behaviors. It does mean understanding that you're setting yourself up for disappointment, constant disappointment, if you expect others to be perfect. Imperfections in others, of course, range along a continuum. Some may be deal breakers, like somebody who's really harshly judgmental or verbally abusive. But many others are just quirks that you can learn to live with. Unhooking yourself from the expectation of perfection in yourself and in others can really be very liberating. So next month, we're going to talk about and look at some of the reasons why we find it so hard to let go of being critical of ourselves and others, and then how to overcome those tendencies so that we really can, enjoy our lives and enjoy people, warts and all, in our lives. So today's topic, which is about dealing with difficult adult children. When I first started in hospice, I was really struck by how incredibly painful it was for a parent to lose a child, no matter what their age, even if they were an adult. And then I got to know more and more parents who were dealing with kids who had mental health issues or became estranged from them or had substance abuse issues. And I realized in some ways that was an equally, if not more horrific kind of loss, because it was the kind of loss that reoccurred every single day, because the person was still alive and yet they weren't available to you. So that got me very interested in the challenges of being a parent to a difficult adult child. And of course, they run along the continuum from kids who, a different generation. I remember a client of mine who, he'd go to the hospital for a procedure and he stayed with his daughter the night before. And, he couldn't eat in the morning, of course, because he was going into surgery, but his wife could. And their daughter had not even thought to leave out a box of cereal or milk or, just some of that really basic stuff that we grew up doing. And yet the generation behind us or even behind those don't seem to honor. But then there's a more serious end of the continuum with people that are really dealing with very impaired and difficult children. So I think it's an important topic. I did update this with some new statistics, but it's unfortunately a universal and widespread problem. And I think it's just so important to talk about it because there's such some sense of shame for parents when they have a child like that, which only leads to more isolation, which only makes this harder. So it's not your imagination. Parents really are today coping with even more significant challenges. It's the first time since the Great Depression that the majority, 52% of young adults between the ages of 19 and 29 are living with their parents. So the majority, over 52% of young adults are living with their parents. And in a new study called The Financial Journey of Modern Parenting, Joy, Complexity, and Sacrifice, Merrill Lynch and Age Wave report that Boomer and Generation X parents are now providing $500 billion annually to the support of their children. And I quote, to put that 500 billion price tag in perspective by Merrill Lynch and Age Wave's reckoning, it works out to twice the amount that parents of adult children are putting into their own retirement accounts. So they're putting out twice as much money for their adult children as they are putting in their own retirement accounts. And those who are even older and are retired are often drawing on their retirement accounts in order to support their children. So this is really a significant change in terms of the financial burden of children that continues even into adulthood. Estrangement between parents and their adult children also seems to be on the rise, and I'm quoting, a large survey of young adults, all college and graduate students at universities in the northeastern US, found that about 17% experienced estrangement from an immediate family member, most commonly from the father. Surveying older adults found that 12% were estranged from their children or child. So it is much more widespread than people realize. There is an old adage, and I'm quoting from an article by Mansfield, that you can only be as happy as your unhappiest child. Estrangement from a child causes heartache, regret, and shame, not to mention the belief that you've failed at one of life's most important tasks. Among the saddest people I met in interviews with older Americans were those living in this situation, said Carl Pilmer, who interviewed more than 1,000 elders for the Legacy Project at Cornell University. He said those were some of the saddest people he interviewed, people that had children who had really distanced themselves. And I see so much of this in my practice, and I know how gut-wrenching it is. Joshua Coleman, who's written a number of books, and you will find I have a link to his webpage at the end under resources. He's written quite a bit about the rift between adult children and their parents. And he said this break between adult children and their parents is happening against a backdrop of parents who likely worked harder than ever to be really good parents. You know, they had a higher standard for themselves maybe than even our parents in terms of how to be good parents, and yet they're still finding their children distancing themselves, which makes it particularly painful. Now, he said in about 70% of the estrangements, parental divorce played a role. And he says, and I'm quoting, "Why would divorce increase the risk? In my clinical work, I have seen how divorce can create a radical realignment of long-held bonds of loyalty, gratitude, and obligation in a family. It can tempt one parent to poison the child against the other. It can cause children to re-examine their lives prior to the divorce and shift their perspective so they now support one parent and oppose the other. It can bring in new people, step-parents or step-siblings, to compete with the child for emotional or material resources. Divorce, as well as separation of parents who were never married, can alter the gravitational trajectory of a family so that over time, family members spin further and further out of one another's reach. And when they do, they rarely might not feel compelled to return. And this is something I've seen quite a bit with the people I work with whose children have become estranged from them. And of course, ironically, it's often the mothers who were always sort of there for them and the father who was less there for them and whose love was harder to win. After the divorce, the children are still what's happening is they're still desperate to win that father's love that they never won. It's easy for them to take mom for granted. And then if you have a father who's manipulative and plays on that, I've seen them really turn their kids against their mother. And I'm sure it happens in the other direction as well. I just haven't seen that as much as in my practice. And it's extremely painful. And the children sort of rewrite history. It puts the parent who's left on the outside in a very painful and difficult position. Now, I add to that people who are parenting a child with serious mental illness, such as, and I'm quoting, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. That presents major life challenges. To be sure, parents may provide decades of extended caregiving, especially during times when their adult son or daughter's debilitating mental health symptoms produce ongoing obstacles to social and occupational functioning and independent living. And again, I know about this quite up close and personal. My partners, just two sisters that have helped facilitate the NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, support groups for parents. One of her best friends out in California facilitates these groups. And I'll tell you, it is gut-wrenching to watch parents deal with a child who has mental illness, because once they're over 18, you often can't compel them to be into treatment. You don't have a lot of legal hold on them. You're watching their lives unfold and them making disastrous decisions. And it's, unfortunately part of their mental illness. And yet it's very difficult to compel treatment. So that's a particularly difficult situation for parents to be in. More than 1/3 of the long-term mentally ill adults live with their families, mostly with aging parents. And even those who live separate from their parents are still heavily dependent on the parents for financial, emotional, and social support, because really it is hard for them to launch into a full adult life because of their compromising mental health. And unfortunately, we see fewer and fewer services provided for those who are mentally ill, which is really exacerbating this problem. And I'm quoting again from another study. The following have been identified as major problems experienced by these caregivers: coping with problem behaviors, dealing with feelings of isolation, interference with household routines, and with meeting the personal needs of other family members, not having adequate information about the significantly mentally ill person's illness, dealing with problems in medication management and compliance, coping with problems related to the relative's impaired social role performance and ability to carry out tasks required for daily living. disruptions to family life, lack of respite from a caregiving responsibility, and insufficient help from the mental health service system. So that's a long list of very painful problems. You have an adult child who won't stay on their medication, and when they don't stay on their medication, even if they've got a job, they'll spiral out of control and lose that job. They can't support themselves, they can't afford health insurance, they can't afford to pay their own rent. Very, very difficult. In the MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment, they found that the most likely targets of violence by those with serious mental illness were family members or friends, 87% of the time. If someone who was mentally ill became violent, the violence was directed at somebody who was a friend or a family, and the violence typically occurred in the home. So, you know, the mentally ill are less of a threat to strangers and much more of a threat to their own immediate family. I'm sure you've all heard horror stories of, you know, very delusional and sick kids who kill a parent. It's a nightmare for parents who are living with it. About half of those who have schizophrenia and a slightly smaller percentage of the people who have bipolar also have an inability to recognize that they are ill. There's a term for it, anosognosia. I'm probably murdering that word. Anyhow, it means that they don't recognize they're sick, that's part of their sickness. You know, they lack the insight that, say, someone with dementia or Alzheimer's disease has. At a certain point, they really don't understand they have dementia. So that certainly complicates problems if you have somebody who is living with illness and don't even believe that they have that illness, which of course then leads to not wanting to be on medication or to get help. It's certainly one of the real complications of trying to help an adult child who struggles with mental illness. Now, think too about all the parents that are dealing with people with substance abuse issues. Nearly 21 million Americans have some form of substance abuse disorder. 21 million Americans is more than the number of people who have had all cancers combined. Think about that. All the cancers combined do not add up to 21 million people. 21 million people, however, have a substance use disorder. And that is far more than even all the cancers combined. That statistic shocked me. We know it's out there. We know substance abuse is a serious problem, but that's just how serious it is. So if you have a family member who's dealing with substance abuse, you are not alone. Yet only 10% of the 21 million, only 10% ever get treatment for their addiction. And most of those who are struggling with addictions obviously have parents who are also suffering because of that child's addiction. So those are some of the very real things that parents are dealing with today with their adult children. I'm going to give you some general ideas about how to be helpful as a parent. Then I want to talk about each of those kind of specific situations. General advice: be a coach when you are asked. This is a quote from Harry Truman. I have found the best way to give advice to your children is to find out what they want and then advise them to do it. Kind of gets at the heart of the matter. They don't necessarily want to hear things that oppose their position on things. So it's a kind of thankless task to try to advise. Jane Isay, who interviewed 70 parents and their grown children for a book called Walking on Eggshells, Navigating the Delicate Relationship Between Adult Children and Their Parents, suggests parents keep their mouths shut and their door open. Easier said than done sometimes. But if you feel you have to advise, and obviously sometimes there are decisions your children are making that are very disturbing and you feel you need to warn them, is to try to not sound judgmental. You can say things like, have you considered? Or, you know, this is really coming from a place of love. And I know you're really struggling and you're doing the best you can. Have you considered blah, 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 and then put out a suggestion. Walk a very fine line, but you've probably been walking that fine line since you had your children. Also, we need to remember that we learned from our mistakes and our children will probably have to learn from their mistakes. If your child doesn't live up to your expectations, try not to interpret that as a failure on your part. You know, you only have so much control over the outcome of something as complicated as shaping another human being. There are many other factors that are at play. So again, accept their imperfections and hope that they will accept yours. We're all doing the best we can out here. So general advice is give advice if they want it and make sure it doesn't sound too judgmental. If they move home, and that's a whole other topic, I've listed a couple of books that I was able to find on this very topic. Key things: communicate, talk about everything from simple chores to very serious issues, and talk ahead of time before the problems arise. Compromise, you're going to have to shift from imposing rules to working things out now as adults. And create space. You need to give your child space for their life, and you need to have space for your life. Also find ways to have time apart for one another. So communicate, compromise, and create space. And it's way more complicated than that, which is why I've given you the link to two different books on dealing with adult children who are still living with you. And that's happening more and more, as you can imagine. If they're asking for money, and again, we could do a whole talk on this, but let me give you some general guidelines. Try to step back, look at the situation objectively. Is it the first time that they've asked you for help, or is this one in a series of demands for more money? Is it a true emergency, such as an unexpected job loss, an illness, or divorce? Or can they, is it something short-term and they'll get over it? If it's an emergency, certainly we'd consider stepping in more readily. If it's an ongoing pattern, you really need to start thinking about whether bailing somebody out financially is in your best interest. And you need to ask yourself whether you can really afford to offer that financial assistance. I quoted you the statistics on parents putting in $500 billion to their adult children's lives, which is double what they're putting into their own retirement accounts. So you need to remember that you're a person too, and you matter, and you need to create safety nets for your own financial well-being. Weigh all of your options. There are other forms of non-financial support that you can give them, such as maybe limited childcare or temporary housing. Perhaps you can share information about deferring student loans. I have a link to that, or credit counseling. Again, I've provided a link for credit counseling. If you do offer money, be realistic about what you can afford and decide whether it is a gift or whether it is a loan. And if you offer a loan, be sure to put those terms in writing. Be clear about your limits. If you offer to help with bills, set a very clear time period, for example, 3 months that you'll do that, but be very clear ahead of time what those limits are. Always keep your finances separate. It is not a good idea to add your adult child's name to your credit card or establish joint accounts with them, because this will affect your credit. And they could end up actually being responsible for your credit card should you die unexpectedly. So it's probably wise not to really put your finances together like that. And again, if you have a child that seems to have a problem with money, you might want to suggest that they get help. There's something called Debtors Anonymous. I've given you the web link for that organization. I had somebody who kept helping out his daughter and, really thought she just was running on going through a spell of bad luck, and then later found out that she was really gambling the money away. And so finally woke up and realized she couldn't keep doing that. So those are some general guidelines on just generally how to talk to your kids, what to do if they want to move home, and how to help them out if they're asking for help financially. Let's get into some of the more serious problems, such as when you're estranged from your children. And I'm talking now not about you choosing to push your kids aside or distance yourself, but your kids choosing to distance themselves from you. Take responsibility for any mistakes you've made. If there's a kernel of truth in their complaints, try to acknowledge that. It doesn't mean you have to buy into their whole spiel about everything you did wrong, but you'll probably get further if you can acknowledge some grain of truth in what they're saying. And if you did make mistakes with your child growing up, look at your own behavior with some self-compassion. You can't have compassion for others if you don't have it first for yourself. I can only imagine, trying to parent when you're barely grown up yourself and struggling with whatever legacy you grew up with from your childhood. It's inevitable that no parent is going to do that job perfectly. Even if you're, just by virtue of being human, you undoubtedly disappointed your child at times. But even if your mistakes were unintentional, you're better served by trying to understand this from your child's perspective, if reconciliation is what's important to you. Unless there's really a lot of distortion in that child's perspective, and I have seen that. I have people that swore up and down that parents were horribly abusive, and I know that parent, and I know they weren't. And so sometimes you really do have kids who distort things. And we're going to talk a little bit about people with a particular disorder known as borderline personality disorder, because they're particularly prone to exaggerating or distorting their sense of injustice, things that were done to them. So, look at it honestly, look at it with eyes of compassion, but don't own something that you didn't do. You might have to make peace with the fact that you're going to have different perspectives on certain experiences. And you might have to give up being right in order to be in relationship. I don't know if you've heard that term, but sometimes you decide, do I want to be right here or do I want to be in relationship? And sometimes, it's more important to maintain the relationship. You can also acknowledge somebody's feelings without having to agree with the rationale behind those feelings. which is advice I often give to people dealing with somebody who has borderline personality disorder. So you validate the emotions, they won't de-escalate, but you don't have to be agreeing with the reason for those feelings. But you'll get further if you say, I'm sorry, it looks like you felt really hurt by that. That's not the same as saying, I hurt you. Some cases, reconciliation is not really an option. In that case, really what you're faced with then is kind of having to grieve that loss because it's a very real loss. You can write to your adult child in a journal, or you can save a box of letters that you would share with them should that opportunity present itself. But also very important, get support. It's hard to be alone with anything this painful. Seek out others who are dealing with this issue, and you'll see there's a list of web pages and other places where you can get support from other parents who are dealing with this kind of estrangement. You are not alone, and it really will help to talk to somebody who's facing something similar. That's a particularly painful experience, feeling estranged from children. How about if you're dealing with a child who has a drug or an alcohol problem? It's really important that you understand this is a family illness because it affects everyone in the family. Families who have an addict in them have extreme tension and constant anxiety in them. Life can be very chaotic and unpredictable and even explosive. And the tone in the house is dictated primarily by the addict's behavior. And even if your adult child doesn't live with you, I'm sure their chaotic life is spilling over into your life and taking a toll on you. Individual members, family members end up walking on eggshells because they don't want to anger or upset the addict, because the addict will then use that as an excuse for, well, I had to go get high or I had to go get drunk because of what you said to me. Don't buy into that. That's bull. But that's the price people often pay, is they're so desperate to kind of keep that person calm that they walk around on eggshells, which is a pretty horrible way to have to live your life all the time. You may have to pretend to yourself and to others that things are just fine. And that happens a lot in families where there's alcoholism. Everybody just pretends it's really just okay. And denial becomes kind of the unspoken rule in that family. But it really undermines any kind of authentic and caring connections between family members, which is why it's not a good long-term solution. The reality is addicts will lie, they will steal, they will manipulate, and they will deplete all of your financial resources that they can get access to support their habit, whether they're gamblers or drug addicts or serious drinkers. So you need to be aware of that. The other thing that's so painful about it is that you as a parent or a spouse, you have to watch someone you love really self-destruct before your eyes. And that's really a painful thing to go through. And if it was easy to save them, we'd all do that, but it usually is not easy to save somebody. So you're watching somebody you love. And I would imagine as a parent, somebody you've invested at least 20 years of your life into, which is one heck of an investment and sacrifice to raise children, and to watch that person just throw their life away is just gut-wrenchingly painful. Parents who have an addicted teen or child or adult child are torn between love and anger. One minute they love them and they feel sorry for them, and in other moments they feel appropriately angry at their behavior. And part of what's so hard is you eventually begin to realize that you're kind of powerless to fix this problem. You can't really fix somebody else's addiction. You lost the person you knew before the addiction took place, and you're missing that person. It's virtually impossible to live with an addict because normal routines are constantly disrupted by unexpected and even frightening events. Even when the addict seeks treatment, we all know that there's a high likelihood of some relapse, that's part of the journey of recovery. And that's pretty gut-wrenching because it's hard enough to get them into treatment in the first place. Family members live in constant fear, especially parents, of learning that their child has died as a result of their drug or their alcohol use, and they constantly worry about the safety of the addict. And I know from working with parents that it's easy to say, let go with love and pull yourself away from that situation. But it's very hard for a parent to do that. It's a very difficult thing to do. It sounds like a great idea in theory, let go with love, and it's very hard to implement. But you will live in constant fear if you know that your child is self-destructing. Family members often feel a sense of shame and guilt that make it difficult for them to seek help and talk to other people about what they're dealing with. If your child had cancer, you wouldn't be afraid to tell your neighbor, But if your child has mental illness or an addiction, you probably feel too embarrassed to tell your neighbor. Reality is, if not that neighbor, then the next one over probably is dealing with something similar. But because we hide that, we don't know that. So there's a lot of shame and guilt, and makes it hard for people to get the parents to get the help and support they need. Parents and others blame themselves for the addiction and the addict. The addict is only too willing to let you blame yourself, because they don't really want to take responsibility for their addiction. So they'll let you blame yourself. So you need to really pay attention to that. The reality is addiction is complicated. It's highly unlikely that you caused your child's addiction. So don't take on more responsibility for that than you should. Like, don't really, take on responsibility for it. They are only going to get well when they take responsibility for their addictions. The other thing that happens for parents is that your needs and the needs of the other family members really get neglected, or they get buried in order to kind of just focus on and manage the addict, which means that, the only feelings that get to matter are the addict's feelings. And so parents feel like their feelings aren't important, and the other kids feel like their feelings aren't important, which just isn't fair. Everybody's needs matter. Those who are trying to protect or fix a person with addiction will discover that despite their best efforts, their well-intended efforts, things usually only get worse until the person hits rock bottom. But you're working overtime because you love this child and you want to help them. And it's really hard to live with the repeated frustration of not being able to be very successful in getting that person into treatment. Addiction is just so disruptive and destructive. All those who are in contact with the addict are likely to be profoundly affected by that addiction, which is why we say alcoholism or drug addiction is a family disorder, because it ripples through the family. And I can't think of who it takes a bigger toll on than the parents. Part of, again, like having to make peace with the child you're estranged from, is part of what you have to do is grieve this loss. That isn't because there's no hope for this child ever getting better, but even now, not being able to have an easy relationship with your child, not being able to see your child bloom in the way you'd hope they would bloom as they got older, just having to live with that right now, whether they ever get treatment or get help or not, that is a significant loss. And you need to be able to sit with that. And sometimes I find we do a million other things just to avoid our feelings. So 9 times out of 10, I'm going to tell you that if you're having a difficult time with something, notice if you're running from your feelings, and sit down and instead let yourself have those feelings. Put on music if you need to cry, write in a journal, but let yourself have the feelings, because you will survive them. It will be probably very painful, but running from them gives them way more control over your life. Sitting with them and realizing you can tolerate them and you will get up and go on is probably the best way to deal with something this painful. I've heard this expression on that show Intervention. They say to the parents, say to this adult child, there isn't anything I wouldn't do to help you, but there's nothing I'm going to do anymore to make it easy for you to keep using. So offer to go with them to a treatment program, or to an AA meeting, or to meet a therapist. Offer to go with them to those things. But if they're unwilling to get help, you need to step back and not enable their addiction. That means not protecting them from the consequences of their addiction, not bailing them out financially, because they're going to bleed you dry as long as you continue to give them money. As long as they have no reason to have to get sober, they won't get sober. Don't allow them to blackmail you with the grandchildren. I've seen that a lot. If you want to see your grandchildren, you're going to give me $500. One thing you can tell them is that you're not afraid to call Child Protective Services if you feel like those children are in jeopardy. And they need to know that, and the children need to know that you would do that if they're not being a very good parent to their kids. So maybe they won't blackmail you quite so much with the grandchildren if they know you're keeping an eye and you're going to make sure those kids are okay. And if they're not, you're going to call in for help. You can't change their behavior. You can only change how you interact with them. The only power you have is over yourself. And that's the key to sort of moving forward. It's okay to save yourself. It's okay to say, I can't do this anymore. This is just taking too much out of me. And it's okay to say, I'm going to focus on my children who are doing better because I can't keep neglecting them. I need to save myself and I need to save the rest of the family. It's okay to reach a breaking point where that's what you need to do. And sometimes it is the greatest act of courage to say, I'm not going to let this craziness in my life anymore. And I'm going to focus on the people who I can help and who I can love and provide support to. Easier said than done, but think about it. Sometimes if you don't say no to the person who's draining everything out of your life, you're basically saying no to all the other people in your life who are getting neglected as a result. And you're saying no to your own life. So sometimes you might have to say no to this one person who won't accept help and that you've tried to get help, and you need to be able to say no, and I'm moving on, or at least for now, and I'm here if you want to get treatment. And focus on the people that are well. Get support. You cannot deal with this alone. That's why we have Al-Anon. That's why we have Nar-Anon meetings. They're available for loved ones of somebody dealing with an addiction. And I'm giving you the phone numbers and websites for where you can get a list of those meetings. They're all the time, just like AA meetings. You can always find one near you. I've listed 2 different recovery places. There's one that's in Ellendale. It's staffed 24/7. You know, people can go there at any time. They even have just a living room where people can hang out and get support if they're beginning to think about recovery. And they have a whole team of peer support specialists that are available to you. There's also one up in Newark, Delaware, and it's a facility-based crisis service for adults experiencing mental health or substance abuse crisis. Again, those services are available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Don't face this alone. It is way too difficult. Finally, let me talk a little bit about children who have psychological problems. And again, you know, people range along the continuum from severe mental illness, but also I find that people who are bipolar or depressed or have extreme anxiety, you know, their lives are very disrupted by their illness. And so it isn't just people who have schizophrenic kids who are struggling. You know, the parents that are helping kids with other mental illnesses along the continuum also are dealing with a lot too. So if you think, well, somebody has it worse than me, don't use that to minimize what you might be going through. First thing is, you know, you really, again, may have to grieve the loss of this child. You're certainly going to have to grieve the loss of the child who was well before they were well. I think of my partner Susan's friend Jeanette and her son who is really quite ill. I remember him as a little boy. I have pictures of him as a little boy and used to play, you know, silly games with him. And you know, one of my favorite was zombies rule, people drool, and we would pretend to be zombies. Just the cutest little kid. And now he's a grown man, and he's very disturbed, and he's on psych meds, so gains a lot of weight. And it's just got to be heartbreaking if I think about that little boy and think, who knew then what we were going to be facing later? If I feel that way, and I'm just a friend of the family, I can only imagine what it's like for the parent. It is a tremendous loss. And again, even if they can get better, even if they can be on medication and be stable, you have lost who you thought your child was going to be. And this is a quote from the American Psychological Association. Parents in particular often have to readjust their hopes or expectations for the future when their child develops a serious mental illness. In the process, you may grieve for the future you thought your child would have. These feelings, though difficult, are totally normal. It's gut-wrenching to watch somebody develop a serious illness and to know that there's only so much you can do. And there's plenty you can do, but you know, you're going to have to grieve what you had imagined their future would be, because it won't be like that. It could still be good, could still have value, and obviously that's the case, but you're still going to have to grieve what you had hoped for them. Offer to get them help, you know, accompany them to a therapist. Good place to find a therapist is Psychology Today has something called Find a Therapist. I gave you the link to it, but if you can't remember it, just Google Find a Therapist Psychology Today. You can put in your zip code. You can look for local therapists. If your son or daughter lives somewhere else, you can put in their zip code. You can see what insurance companies, what insurance payments they take, what their fees are, what their specialties are. You can really find some good people that will be a good match, or at least potentially a good match for your child. So look at Psychology Today if you're looking for therapists for your child, and offer to go with them. Also, educate yourself about mental illness. Don't blame yourself or think you can cure your son or daughter. These can be very serious and very entrenched problems, and they're not easily remedied without professional help. The good news is that many of them are very treatable, especially with a combination of medication and psychotherapy. The challenge will be often to keep your child on the medication or in therapy, but there are good treatment options. and they may never be the child you had thought they were going to be, but they can be functioning at a much higher level with the right amount of support. You can find information about any of the mental health disorders at the National Alliance on Mental Illness webpage, and I've given you the link there. A mental illness should not somehow be more shameful than a physical illness, but social messages make us feel differently. Psychological issues are far more common than people realize. For example, one study found that close to 50% of the general public meets the criteria for at least one psychological condition under the DSM-4. So they're more common than you think. And it's really sad that we create such shame around it. If you said this before, but if you told your friends that your daughter came down with cancer, they'd come over with casseroles. But when you tell them your daughter's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, if you even have the nerve to say that, people often, many people will probably say mine too, but some people will sort of back away from you, or that's our fear. And it's just so unfortunate because no one chooses a mental illness any more than they choose a physical illness. And in some ways, it's much harder to deal with a mental illness. Again, you have to revise your expectations for your child. Can be very helpful to acknowledge the child that courage it takes to deal with this kind of illness on a day-to-day basis, because it does. Very important not to take their behaviors personally. It can be very hard to do that. And some people are very good at sort of knowing exactly how to make you feel bad about yourself. But this is their illness talking, and you have to remind yourself of that. Don't neglect your own needs and feelings. Of course, that's very challenging, but it's just critical. And this is a quote. One of the best things you can do to keep them mentally healthy is to take care of yourself. Modeling good habits will create a healthier environment for your adult children, and a healthier environment for yourself. You can find additional information about being a caregiver. Again, NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, has a special section just for family members and caregivers. Be aware of the resources that are available to you. The National Alliance on Mental Health maintains a helpline that's available Monday to Friday from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. And I put the number in there on your handout. If you're not sure what to do, you have questions, call NAMI. I went to a conference out in San Francisco. It was sponsored by National Alliance on Mental Illness, and I sat in on one of the groups that was for parents. And what I quickly learned was, the other parents are the ones who know sort of the nitty-gritty stuff about where you might be able to get housing for your child. They know things that you can't read in a book. They're the ones that are also out there in the trenches with you, and often have an amazing amount of information that they can share with you. There are NAMI groups for parents online. There are, I think I've listed it further down, but there are groups locally. And some people feel self-conscious about joining something local. Well, there's an online support group for parents of young adults and adults with mental illness. Because so many of these meetings are being done virtually, you could attend a NAMI meeting for parents in California, somewhere where you're not going to bump into somebody Also, you should know that there is something called the Delaware Mobile Crisis Intervention Service, where you can call them, and in all likelihood, they will be willing to come out to your home to assess somebody who is having a breakdown or really in need of help. They're available 24 hours a day, and I've given you the numbers for where to call if you're calling from Northern Delaware or Southern Delaware. And it's good to know that they're out there. If you end up with an adult child, though, who seems to get caught in an endless series of crises, and they always sabotage your efforts to get help, you might be dealing with a very distinctive kind of personality disorder. People know I've done whole talks on just this, and I could do another whole talk on this, but just to give you a heads up on this one, because this one is something that might not look like mental illness in a traditional sense, but is an incredibly disruptive personality disorder. And what that means is it's sort of wired into the person's personality. It isn't like depression comes over them. This really becomes who they are, what their personality is like. It's very disruptive. It's not really obvious. The first time I gave a talk on this, I guess the Cape Gazette or somebody had done a little blurb on sort of the characteristics. And I remember walking in, and Sandra probably remembers this, there was like 60 people waiting to get in for this talk. And some woman came up to me and said, "Oh my God, I now know what my sister is. I never knew." So just listen to this list of characteristics. If it sounds like somebody that you're dealing with, read more about it. Hypersensitive to criticism. They easily perceive things as being critical, even when that wasn't necessarily intended to be critical, but they're hypersensitive to it. They adore you one minute, they hate you the next. It's black and white. You're on the pedestal, you're in the gutter. There's no in between. They can be very manipulative. They believe it's never their fault. They're always the victim. Somebody did it to them. They never take responsibility and see their role in something that goes wrong. And they can make you feel guilty, like you did something wrong, even though some part of you knows you didn't. But they are very good at making sure somebody else takes the blame because they never accept responsibility. They have extreme emotions. They can fly into a rage in a split second over very little things. They're very emotionally unstable in that sense. They can become enraged or terrified if they feel someone is going to abandon them. That's kind of their trigger. Might not be obvious that they're perceiving a situation as abandonment, but believe me, that's what they're responding to. They're often very impulsive. They engage in self-destructive behaviors. They threaten suicide. They make suicide gestures. They cut themselves. Cutting is a very strong indication that somebody struggles with borderline personality disorder. They have a strong need to control situations and everybody around them. Their frame of reference for how life is going to be good is always external. Like they'll be okay if everybody treats them perfectly. You know, they don't look at learning to regain that control within themselves. And there's one person who's been very successful with borderline personality disorder people, and her name is Marsha Linehan. She herself had borderline personality disorder and was in and out of hospitals as an adolescent. And she said to herself, if I can figure out how to handle this, I'm going to teach other people. So her program is really premised on mindfulness, which is really teaching people to observe their emotions versus be their emotions. Borderlines are their emotions. They're their emotions. They go from 0 to 100 in a split second. She teaches them to step back and observe their emotions and not be their emotions. She teaches them that they can get the things they need in a relationship without being manipulative. She teaches them ways to self-soothe and discharge strong feelings. The model is really about teaching them how to take responsibility for life and have the tools they need to manage their extreme sensitivity and reactivity. It's a very successful program, but they kick people out if they don't participate. So it's not uncommon for it to be done in a 10-week group. You miss one meeting, you're out. So it's a very kind of tough love and kind of strict approach, but on the other hand, the people that really stick with it really get a lot from it. I did a support group for adults who grew up in alcoholic families, and I had one person join the group who told me she was borderline and had been through a DBT program. And I said, you're welcome to join the group, but if I see you acting out or trying to sort of pull people into taking care of you in a way that I think isn't healthy, I'll call you out on it. And the first time we went around the room and people talked about the disruption in their lives by a parent or family member who had mental illness or substance abuse, we came to her and she said, I feel like an alcohol salesperson in an AA meeting. What she meant by that was she knew that she had engaged in similar behavior that disrupted other people's lives and really understood how painful that was for the people, because she was hearing it now from other people, how painful it can be to deal with somebody so emotionally out of control. And I stroked her and encouraged her every time. She was very competent, and she was very competent. Borderlines are very smart. They read people very well. And she did really well in the group. The other way you'll know you're dealing with somebody's borderline is if you feel like you're always walking on eggshells with them. One of the most classic books written about this is called Stop Walking on Eggshells. They have a companion book, Randy, I can't think of her last name. She has a second book called The Concise Family Guide to Dealing with Borderline Personality Disorder. Really good suggestions. I'll give you some general guidelines, but really, if you're dealing with this, get that book and read more about it. Read about borderline personality, get support for yourself. Believe me, you'll probably want your own therapist because they're going to put you through a lot. Learn not to personalize their attacks. That's very hard because, as I said, they read people really well and they really know how to nail you. If you feel guilty, step back and consider that it's part of their manipulation and get unhooked. In fact, that's the key thing, is understanding what keeps you stuck. Why do you stay with this? Why do you tolerate this kind of unacceptable behavior? Is it fear? Is it low self-esteem? Are you wanting to rescue this person? So that's important to understand why you're stuck. Also, learn to communicate assertively. Acknowledge what they're saying, validate those emotions. You don't have to validate the reason for their emotions, but acknowledge what they're saying, because they'll only escalate and scream louder if you don't. Delay, if they're being abusive in this conversation, do things like say, I can't give you the undivided attention I want right now. Can you wait 30 minutes and we'll talk about it? Because sometimes just that time limit will help them defuse. Don't defend yourself, don't accuse them. That's going to escalate the situation. And then encourage teamwork, sort of try to help them, get them invested in coming up with a solution to the problem so that they buy into it. Set limits with love and reinforce good behavior. Again, those are very general guidelines. If you are dealing with this, read more about it and consider Randy's book. Randy Krieger, I think is her name, and it's The Concise Family Guide to Dealing with Borderline Personality Disorder. They really are good at hooking in people who really are caring and empathic, but you will never feel like you ever fill them up. It's never going to be enough. So you better learn that now and find out ways to deal with it. Finally, if you're dealing with somebody in your life who's got mental illness, get support. You should not deal with this on your own. It really is something you need help with. As I said, National Alliance on Mental Illness does something called the Family to Family Educational Program, 12-week course for family and friends. You might be able to attend a group in another state if you're worried about, running into people you know. They also do ongoing monthly support groups. I don't know how active any of them are, but there are ones in Rehoboth, Dover, Newark, and Wilmington. Call their toll-free number and get more information. Let me conclude with just a few quotes. A grown-up is a child with layers on, Woody Harrelson. There are only two lasting bequests we can hope to give our children. One of them is roots, the other is wings, and that's from Goethe. The sad truth is, sometimes you have to protect yourself from certain people, no matter how much you love them. And that is often the case for parents dealing with difficult adult children. And finally, I can't control your behavior, nor do I want that burden. I will not apologize for refusing to be disrespected or lied to or to be mistreated. I have standards: step up or step out. So I know I've said a lot. Let's see if we can take some questions here.
So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, and we'll just be respectful and one at a time, okay?
These are big topics. If you're dealing with any one of them, read more.
Mm-hmm. And if not, any questions, anybody have?
I have an interesting, I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Dr. Judy, this is very interesting because I have been slandered and bullied within a group, within a church. And what's interesting about this is the third time when you use the word disrespect, and it happens to be a church that is into harmony and all these goody kinds of things. And interestingly enough, I've had 3 situations several years apart, but this is an extreme one where there is someone who is ill, as you described, so I brought it to the minister, but all I can do, I feel, besides legally, because I would actually have legal recourse with a particular person who's really spread some lies. So here's what I just thought, if you had any advice. If the minister does not answer, I do plan on going further because of how they have set up their groupings. And with some of my knowledge, I could help them to have people not be so manipulative in a group, because obviously someone was rescued and I was, I ended up being the victim. Although, so this is a bigger organizational kind of thing. So any comments?
Well, I've heard similar kinds of stories, and I think sometimes, in all fairness, that the religious folks, ministers, rabbis, priests, they aren't they're not as well trained in dealing with some of these issues. I mean, it's one thing to know if someone's depressed. Borderline personality disorder is not something everybody knows about, and I think ministers and other religious folks often don't like conflict. They don't know how to deal with conflict, and they really don't understand that they have somebody who's pretty toxic, and yet alone, and then on top of that, are ill prepared with how to deal with it. I find it very educational to give people information about borderline personality disorder, and often they'll read it and they'll go, "Oh my God, that's exactly what I'm dealing with." And might be worth sharing something like that with your minister, because they may be, clueless, or rabbi or whatever, they may be clueless as to this. And unfortunately, borderlines are they like to get people on their team, and if you're not on their team, you're their enemy. There's no in between. And so they can be very disruptive in groups. And I think anybody who's facilitating a group, probably needs to understand a lot more about psychology and group dynamics, because they will put them through the ringer. And I feel for you. The other thing I sometimes talk to people about is that triangle, the rescuer, the persecutor, and the victim, and how people shift around in those different roles. You obviously know that. I know you have a background, obviously, in the field. So
Well, here's what's interesting. I'm trying to avoid naming borderline histrionic and manipulative, which is and narcissistic. I'm avoiding naming the issue as much as how these groups and some of the things they permit, the behavior permits manipulation. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And I will continue up the line if I don't get a response.
Yeah, I think you have a right to stand up for yourself. And, you're the victim this time, but that kind of game is going to get played out with other people too.
Well, it's kind of obvious because of some of the rules within the, that they permitted the group to get together, make a decision, and the person did not come and attend. See, they kept themselves distant and let the group rescue them.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you.
Best of luck with you. You know more than anybody what you're up against.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you.
I don't like to label either. I don't even usually use diagnostic labels, but I do feel with some of the borderline stuff that it's a diagnosis people don't understand. And so to know that it really is a psychological constellation, at least it's validating for people that they are observing something that is not, because the borderline is also very good at saying people don't understand me, they judge me, see everybody's turning against me. That's all part of the manipulation. So like I said, I don't usually use diagnostic labels, and I have a great deal of compassion for this disorder. I would never want to have it. But on the other hand, I think sometimes for people to understand that it is a very real phenomenon, with a diagnosis, if that's one way it should destigmatize it in some ways, because it is a form of mental illness. But I know what you're saying, but I think sometimes that's the only way people can kind of understand, get outside of the group dynamics and understand that we really do have one person who really is a toxic influence. And obviously other people are playing along, but so I don't know. That's the only reason I ever kind of even use that label, but because unfortunately it's true.
I appreciate
Lots of luck, Michelle. I'm so sorry.
Well, I'm feeling good because a group home was named after me. So
I heard about that. You should. You got plenty of laurels to rest on.
Yeah, so I got a chuckle on that one.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Thank you.
Yeah, Kathy M.
Yes. I was really puzzled about children that won't speak to their parents for no good reason. And one is well, these are all my church family friends, older couples, and it's their kid, 3 different instances. The one that has 3 children, it's the middle daughter that wants nothing to do with the mother. Now there's no abuse, there was no alcohol, there was no reasons.
Yeah.
Others there might have been a divorce. And the third one, her son and daughter happened to marry snobs, and the daughter-in-law and son-in-law just kind of like, so I kind of like don't like the class of your parents or something.
No, I've seen that. And you're stuck as a parent because you don't want to come between your child and their spouse, right? I mean, you just know somehow that's not appropriate. But on the other hand, sometimes that child or spouse is the problem, whether it's snob or they're sort of manipulative and they want to isolate the adults. I mean, it's a really catch-22. And all I can tell you is so many people in my practice are dealing with this, and it's heartbreaking. And I don't even know half the time what the real reasons are, because they can't find out either, and it's baffling. And it's I think at the end of the day, you want the answers, you want to understand why, but you may have to live with the fact that you may never understand why. And the real challenge is to figure out how to keep going on with your life. And it's
these 3 couples did. They're
good.
past the begging stage, throwing money at them stage, bargaining stage. They have just come to, they did their grieving.
Yeah.
And they just had to let them go, but I'm the one that's saying, why?
I know. I totally understand that. The other thing is, a lot of times if people treat you badly, it says more about them than it says about you. And it's hard to hold on to that. It'd be one thing if you really, and that's why I do say, if you think you did something wrong, do be willing to look at that, be willing to hear them out. But I've just seen so many instances where that does not seem to have been the case. These kids were not abused. And so it's so hard to hold on to the fact that it probably says something about that child, that adult child, than it's ever going to say about you, because it feels so personally. It feels so personal, but it's some mishigas in them. It's some unresolved stuff in them. And they probably had no hand in it, but it's frustrating to not know why. I mean, I'm a cognitive person. I want to understand things. So I think it's really hard to make peace with. It's like when somebody breaks up with you and they never tell you, they ghost you and you never know why they broke up with you. It's like, first thing you do is you're going to project whatever you don't like about yourself onto that person, right? You're going to assume, oh my God, they don't like me because I'm fat or I'm this, or, and so you'll immediately beat yourself up on what you think are your faults. And 9 times out of 10, it's more about them. It's not about you.
Well, I will tell them, thank you. And you are the fastest talker I have ever met.
And I'm trying to slow down.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It was that Irish family I grew up in. If you wanted to tell your story, you had to jump in fast.
I'm the same way.
Dr. Judy, a quick question.
Sure.
How about children of a parent that has borderline personality disorder?
There's a book, and because I had a client like this when I was up in Boston, there's a book called When Your Mother Has Borderline Personality Disorder that's geared to an adult who can read and understand that. But I know you're probably talking about younger kids.
I am. But I guess I think maybe that would help me.
Mm-hmm.
I actually wasn't familiar with this term until today, but thank heavens, sorry, let me silence that. Sandra sent the handout and I read that before we started. And as soon as I read the words, I thought, oh my goodness, this is what my daughter has. And I did not know this.
This is what so many people say to me. And I always say, I can't diagnose somebody I haven't met, but you read this list of characteristics. And if at the end of the thing, you go, holy moly, that is exactly what I've been dealing with. And there's a pretty good likelihood that's what you're dealing with.
Right.
So really relieving in some ways. The best thing you can do is just love those kids as unconditionally as you can and be a stable influence in their life, so that they always know they have somebody they can come talk to. But I've had other people ask me that. I had divorcees who a father who wanted to know how to help his children who primarily live with their mother, who clearly seem to have these characteristics. And, I just think all you can do is love those children and let them know that they can always talk to you about anything. But the parents are particularly manipulative of their children who are borderline, and they expect their children in some ways to meet their emotional needs. So anything you do that lets that child know that their emotional needs are important to you, and you want to know what they need and what they want and how you can be there for them, that in and of itself will be therapeutic. I had a guy who grew up with an alcoholic parent, and he had grandparents that when he would stay with them during the summer, they'd wake up every morning and say, what do the kids want to do today? And the idea that somebody cared about what he wanted to do blew his mind. So just to let those kids know that you want to know how they feel and what they need, and to try to be there for them and let them know they can talk to you about anything, that'll pay off down the road, if not in the here and now. It's very tough, very tough.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah. And often I would say get those kids into counseling, but borderline mothers usually don't want their kids to go into counseling because they know the therapist might question the parent's behavior.
And I've tried to get my daughter back into counseling. She was in counseling for a brief period of time, and I've done everything that I know to do. And she isn't going back into counseling. And her husband, and I dearly love him, he was a double major, and psychology was his second major. And I'm thinking, okay, now that I've read this today, why doesn't he see this? Because he and I had lunch last year and at his invitation. And during our conversation, he said if he had to diagnose my daughter's issue, he would say that she suffered from anxiety.
Mm,
I also didn't know anything about that. So I came home and I Googled that, and as I was reading that, I thought, I don't see this, but
yeah, yeah. Well, if you, my email address is on the handout, and I think Sandra also put hers and mine up in the chat. I can send you, I have done a whole 3-hour talk on this, so I could send you that handout. At some point, if you thought it was appropriate to share that with him, but you have to tread lightly and say, I can't be sure, but I want you to read this and see if you feel like it captures what you're dealing with. Because it'd be helpful for him to be informed.
thank you for that. I will email you because
Okay.
that would be extremely helpful.
Okay.
At this moment in time,
Yeah.
my
When it
daughter
clicks,
and
it
I,
clicks.
we just,
Yeah, I'm sure you have your hands full.
yes. Thank you.
My heart goes out to you. Hang in there.
Trying.
Yeah.
So I don't see anyone else that's unmuted or anything else in the chat that indicates
Okey-dokey.
anybody has any questions.
Okay.
So I'll just give a general invitation. If anybody wants to unmute themselves and say goodbye, have a great weekend, anything, you're more than welcome. And then this concludes Dr. Judy's talk.
Okay. We'll talk to you next month.
Yes,
If you have more
October.
questions,
What's the
October
date?
the 1st, I think it is. I think it's
Yes.
October 1st. And
Yep.
again, if anybody wants to ask a more personal question, feel free to email me or Sandra. And we'll get back to you.
Right. Bye. Thank you, Dr. Judy.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Bye.
Bye.
Everybody.
I appreciate it.
Love you all.
Big help.
All right, good.
You're
Take care.
welcome.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, that's a tough one. But when people read that description, I mean, I hate to pathologize people, but that's the one
Yeah,
diagnosis that can be so helpful for people to understand that's what they're dealing with.
yeah,
you know?
yeah. And also when you have just certain people that just kind of just drain your energy.
Yeah.
Oh,
Something
just
force out of you.
drain your energy.
Yeah.
And you just can't seem to do anything right. You know?
Yeah, exactly. It's never enough or it's not right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's always good-hearted, kind of empathic people who get pulled into their orbit, and try so hard. And then they finally get frustrated. And then the borderline says, see, I knew you were mad at me. And I'm like,
Yeah.
it's vicious. It's so
Yeah.
tough. And again, I do feel for people with it. It's got to be torture. It's got to be a torturous way to live your life.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah, it's a
So-
torturous way to live.
So yeah, almost you have to preserve yourself,
do,
and
I
whatever boundaries and consistencies and
That's actually the only thing, that really will work is setting pretty clear boundaries. But that book that Randy Krieg wrote on the Concise Family Guide, she goes into all the different details on like what is hooking you, why do you stay and put up with this, all the ways to communicate more effectively, all the ways to help de-escalate. It's really a good book for anybody dealing with this, All right, everybody. Well, we'll see you next month, right, Sandra?
yes, absolutely.
All right, have a good weekend.
Be there. All
Thank
right.
you again.
Take
Okay.
care, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Judy.
You're welcome.